Welcome to this historical deep dive. Today, we're jumping right into one of the most debated, consequential narratives in all of human history. We're going to examine the ancient texts, the stories, and the historical records to see exactly what modern academia reveals about an event that quite literally changed the world.
So, where exactly does faith meet logic? The story of the empty tomb is the absolute centerpiece of the Easter holiday, and for believers, it represents tangible proof of a miraculous resurrection. But what happens when we take this foundational story and put it under the microscope of modern historical critical science? What happens if we apply the exact same rules to this narrative that we apply to literally any other event in antiquity? Well, it turns out, when you look at the research from secular historians, the story takes a very unexpected turn.
Okay, let's dive right in. We're going to structure this historical detective story into 4 quick steps: the burial problem, the evolution of the legend, some alternative natural explanations, and finally, the psychological key.
Starting us off, Step 1, the burial problem.
Before we even look at the burial itself, we've got to set some ground rules for our investigation. When scholars use the historical critical method, they can't just point to miracles to explain an event. History, as an academic discipline, works strictly with probability. It asks, based on what we actually know about the time, the culture, and the laws, what most likely happened. And from a purely historical standpoint, the story of the empty tomb hits a massive wall almost immediately. And this brilliantly illustrates exactly what that wall is. Think about the documented reality of Roman practice. Crucifixion wasn't just a simple death penalty. It was the ultimate punishment, purposely designed for absolute humiliation and the literal erasure of a person's existence. The Romans intentionally banned proper burials for crucified rebels. Bodies were left up on the crosses for days as food for scavengers, birds, feral dogs, basically serving as a horrific billboard warning anyone thinking of rebelling. Whatever was left was usually just tossed by soldiers into shallow, unmarked mass graves for criminals. Now contrast that grim reality with the narrative's introduction of Joseph of Arimathea. He's a Jewish council member who supposedly gets special permission from Pontius Pilate, a prefect famous for his sheer, uncompromising brutality, to take down a condemned rebel and give him a dignified burial in an expensive, rock-hewn tomb. Historically speaking, scholars argued this scenario is extremely improbable. In fact, many historians view Joseph of Arimathea as a literary invention, essentially a pious fiction created later on to give the resurrection story a dignified starting point.
So here's the absolutely crucial takeaway. The biggest problem with the empty tomb isn't figuring out how it got empty. The real issue is whether the tomb even existed in the first place. If the historical reality is that Jesus was thrown into a nameless mass grave or left on the cross as criminals usually were, well, the entire narrative of an empty tomb collapses right at the starting line.
That brings us to Step 2, the evolution of the legend. But hey, let's look at the texts themselves. Let's move to the timeline and see how this builds by plotting the New Testament texts chronologically. We start around 50 CE with the Apostle Paul, move to Mark around 70 CE, Matthew around 85 CE, and finally John around 100 CE. By laying it out like this, historians notice a classic hallmark of a developing legend.
The way this story swells over time is honestly fascinating. Back in 50 CE, the Apostle Paul writes the very first text. He mentions a resurrection, sure, but absolutely no empty tomb. For Paul, it seems the empty tomb was either entirely unknown to him or just completely unimportant. Jump forward 20 years to 70 CE, the Gospel of Mark. Here we get the very first mention of a tomb. Women find the stone rolled away, a young man inside says Jesus is risen, and the women run away in terror, telling no one. And that's where the original story ended. No physical appearances at all. But jump to 85 CE. Matthew writes his account, and the story has grown dramatically. Now we've got a massive earthquake, an angel descending from heaven, and crucially, Roman guards who faint from fear. Why add guards? Well, historical context tells us Matthew likely invented them because Jewish critics at the time were arguing that someone had simply stolen the body. Fast forward again to 100 CE in the Gospel of John, and the narrative is a spectacular epic. The tomb is full of angels, the burial cloths are neatly folded, the apostles are having foot races to the site, and Mary Magdalene is having full-blown conversations with Jesus.
So when academics apply Occam's razor, the principle that the simplest explanation is usually the right one, the conclusion is pretty clear. These changing, dramatically swelling details over 50 years do not point to consistent eyewitness reportage. Instead, the secular consensus suggests we're watching a theological myth grow in real time. It's expanding and adding dramatic details because the early church needed to defend and glamorize its foundational story.
Moving right along to step 3, alternative natural explanations.
Now, as any good historical investigator should, let's play devil's advocate for a second. What if, totally against Roman custom, there actually was a private tomb, and on that Sunday morning it really was empty? Well, even if we grant that, historians still have to prefer historically probable natural explanations over supernatural ones, and there are 3 highly probable scenarios right off the bat. First up, a moved body. The body might have been temporarily stored in a nearby tomb because the Sabbath or Pesach was quickly approaching, and later moved by family, authorities, or the tomb owner without the scattered disciples ever knowing. Second, grave robbery. This was an incredibly common crime in the ancient world, so common in fact that Roman law had exceedingly harsh penalties just for that. Third, the wrong tomb. Think about it. Grieving, traumatized women navigating a graveyard in the dim morning twilight could have incredibly easily arrived at an empty tomb by mistake. Any of these natural explanations are statistically and historically way more probable than a literal suspension of the laws of physics.
Which leads us to our 4th and final step, the psychological key.
This leaves us with a massive, massive puzzle. If there was no empty tomb, or if the body was just moved, where in the world did this intense belief in the resurrection come from? Because historians don't think the disciples were lying. They genuinely believed Jesus was alive, to the point where these cowards who fled the crucifixion suddenly transformed into bold martyrs willing to die for this belief. Why? Now, what's really interesting about this is that it provides the psychological key to the entire mystery. Modern science points to a very well-documented phenomenon known as bereavement visions. Following a sudden, traumatic loss of a loved one or a charismatic leader, it is scientifically proven that a significant percentage of grieving people experience highly vivid, powerful hallucinations of the deceased. They hear them, see them, sometimes even feel their touch. And this isn't classified as a mental illness. It's a known psychological mechanism the human brain uses to process extreme grief and profound cognitive dissonance. And imagine the dissonance here. The disciples believed Jesus was the Messiah meant to rule, and instead he was suddenly violently executed on a cross.
Let's connect the dots here and see how this sparks an entire global movement. Step 1. The disciples experienced the sudden, extremely traumatic loss of their Messiah. Step 2. Overloaded with grief and cognitive dissonance, Peter and a few other followers experienced these intense visual bereavement visions. Step 3. In the context of their first-century worldview, they interpret these visions not as a psychological coping mechanism, but as absolute proof that God has exalted Jesus to heaven, making him a supernatural ruler. It was these ecstatic, visionary experiences, not a physical empty tomb, that truly gave birth to Christianity.
It's a truly fascinating intersection, right? Where ancient faith collides head-on with modern historical logic. So I want to leave you with a really provocative thought to ponder. When you look at the evidence we've structured today, which of these minimal facts do you personally believe is the strongest? Is it the empty tomb itself, the sudden conversion of Paul, or maybe the radical psychological transformation of the disciples? Which one, if any, do you think truly defies a natural secular explanation? Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history around you.